But as a preamble to the scope of work that's proposed, I'd like to briefly go over again some of the context and the intent for the 2050 policy and the implementing regulations that were developed. And this is partly because many, such as myself, weren't around for the development of the 2050 policy and tend to take it for granted and don't recognize some of the importance of the context that shaped its development. By the early to mid-1990s, the county was forecasting that the northern part of Sarasota County would essentially be reaching its capacity for growth within the urban service area at typical densities that we had developed at. And having experienced at least 3 prior decades of extensive growth and a diminishing urban land supply in the North County, meant an expectation for continuing pressure to move the urban service boundary to accommodate that. In the mid-1990s, a policy was put into the comprehensive plan which called for a development of a plan for east of the interstate to delineate the ultimate uses of land. So it was a ultimate build-out plan policy that was called for. As you all know, the planning effort that resulted from that was a multi-year effort. It involved extensive community conversation and ultimately compromise. Its ultimate result was the Sarasota 2050 policy and its implementing regulations. Some of the detail that's found in the plan and in the regulations really can be attributed in part to the time at which 2050 was adopted. There were certain state oversight-related planning requirements. For example, the original planning didn't have the year 2050 associated with it. This was intended to be a build-out plan for the county. Some of the details that are in the plans were a result of negotiations, concerns for preventing certain scenarios from occurring. The intent, though, the overall intent was grounded in a recognition that growth would continue to occur in Sarasota County and that we should proactively plan for that growth. The result was that the county wanted to hold this growth to a new, higher standard, take advantage of an opportunity to plan for future development that avoided many of the negatives that were perceived with the status quo development patterns. The higher bar for development then was intended to create a build-out plan, settle concerns then about that would have surrounded any kind of incremental moving of the urban service boundary. And so some of that background I think is helpful to sort of fill in the why or the intent of what the 2050 policy and regulations are intended to accomplish. Now, the how of how we accomplish that policy, what we've referred to in the past as sort of the 3 legs of the stool for the 2050 program. And that's open space environment, the design or form of development, often referred to as new urbanism, although it's not new at all. And then the requirement that any new growth pay its own way through fiscal neutrality. So how that growth takes place was set up to be an optional overlay, an incentive-based policy in exchange for higher expectations. And I'll just briefly go through the tenets of 2050 here. We've been through these many times. Open space is starting with an interconnected kind of system that conserves natural habitats and starts with that as a basis for mapping. The form of development, again, was a reaction to the kind of development that Sarasota County had experienced in the decades prior, and the intent was to take advantage of the opportunity to do something different that would be compact, it would be walkable, interconnected with a variety of housing types and mix of uses. And then the requirement then that any of the development that takes place outside the urban service boundary pays its own way initially and then over time as well. So 10 years later, we find ourselves in a position to both look back and look forward to evaluate how the plan is working. What we've heard is that the intent is still valid. Overall, the how we get there is aimed at achieving the benefit of 2050, and that it can really result or benefit, from an objective and open-minded evaluation. So we have the benefit of looking at 10 years worth of development and planning at other new urbanist places to see what's succeeded, what hasn't succeeded, to see what changes in the real estate world are different from the time at which 2050 policy and regulatory development took place. There's the benefit of user experience with our existing policies and regulations. And what we're looking at as guidance moving forward is an opportunity to, as objectively as possible, evaluate this ambitious set of planning policies and regulations. We as staff, we're not looking to either tear down or defend 2050. We want to take an open-minded, objective look at this. There are many different ways to achieve the tenets of 2050, and it's important, especially in the context of a program that's voluntary and is intended to incentivize a better form of development, that we go back for a checkup and see how we're doing. In going for this checkup, there are some aches and pains that have been identified, and we've taken a look at the issues that have been identified by 2050 development interests, by members of the public. We as staff have taken a look at its implementation. Another thing to emphasize here, too, is that the issues that are in the scope of work that are identified for evaluation haven't been concluded at this point. The scope of work identifies the process that we're going to be going through to conduct an objective review and analysis. We will be sharing the findings, recommendations, along with any of the rationales that go in support or not support of changing that in a public way. We want to be very transparent. We will be sharing that via our website and in a limited number of community workshops. We welcome feedback, debate, scrutiny, and again, we want to be transparent in this upcoming process. So ultimately, any changes that may be proposed will be evaluated in public hearings before both the Planning Commission and the Board.